January 1945. A snow-covered, blood-stained field hospital near Bastogne. Red Cross flags flap violently in the freezing Belgian wind, their white fabric stained with soot and ice. Inside the canvas tents, the silence is heavy, broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen earth. Advancing American troops have just recaptured this vital crossroad, but they do not find a working medical station. They find a slaughterhouse. An SS unit overran the facility the night before, leaving the unarmed medics and wounded men executed directly in their cots. Now, the captured German commander stands outside the tent, completely unmoved by the carnage behind him. He snaps a sharp salute to an American captain, demanding a private heated room and professional military courtesy. He believes his high rank protects him from the blood on his hands. He is entirely wrong. General George Patton is on his way, and his response will redefine military courtesy in a way this commander will never forget. This is the story of an SS commander who massacred defenseless medics, and the American general who delivered a brutal, mirrored lesson in accountability. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they'd done. Captain John Sullivan was 29 years old, a hard-nosed infantry officer from the rough streets of Hell's Kitchen, New York. He served with the 10th Armored Division, leading men through some of the bloodiest mud in Europe. Sullivan had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, motivated by a fierce sense of protective duty. He left behind a younger brother, a gentle boy who could not bear the thought of carrying a rifle, but wanted to save lives instead. Sullivan had used his influence to get his brother assigned as a medic within his own sector, believing he could keep him safe. He had survived the freezing trenches and the artillery barrages, always driven by the need to protect his family. That illusion shattered completely when his unit reclaimed the crossroad and he walked into the main medical tent. He found his younger brother lying still, executed in his own cot with a bullet to the brain. Sturmbannführer Hans von Kleist was 38 years old, a seasoned major in the Waffen SS who originally hailed from Munich. He was a devout believer in the radical racial hierarchy of the regime, viewing his enemies as biological errors. Even after days of brutal winter combat, Kleist managed to keep his tailored black coat completely immaculate and lined with expensive fur. He carried himself with the supreme arrogance of an aristocratic elite who believed the rules of ordinary humanity did not apply to his class. To Kleist, exterminating wounded enemies and their caretakers was not a war crime, but a matter of cold, tactical calculation. He genuinely believed that the officer class shared an exclusive brotherhood that transcended the slaughter of common soldiers. He stood in the snow, waiting for the Americans to recognize his superior breeding and grant him the comforts he felt he deserved. By January 1945, the Western Front had devolved into a meat grinder of unprecedented ferocity. The German army had launched its massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, catching the Western Allies by surprise and creating a dangerous bulge in the front lines. Supplies were dangerously low on both sides. The roads were choked with thick ice, and the temperature dropped well below freezing every single night. In the chaos of this massive winter campaign, small medical units and field hospitals were frequently cut off from their parent divisions. The front lines shifted rapidly and unpredictably, turning safe rear area sanctuaries into active combat zones within a matter of minutes. Units isolated in the snow had to fend for themselves, completely stripped of their normal armored protection. In this climate of absolute desperation, standard procedures and military regulations began to break down across the battlefield. Many field commanders chose to look the other way when faced with minor breaches of protocol or harsh treatment of prisoners, prioritizing rapid movement over strict adherence to international treaties. The Geneva Convention was often treated as a luxury that could not be afforded in the frozen forests of Belgium. Yet, even in the absolute worst conditions of the war, a distinct line remained between the grim realities of combat and outright butchery. Most officers still respected the sanctity of the Red Cross painted on tents and helmets, knowing they might need that same mercy tomorrow. But certain specialized units operated under an entirely different set of rules, viewing the chaos of the retreat as an opportunity to discard civilized restraints entirely. They acted with complete impunity, believing that the freezing weather and the fog of battle would hide their crimes from the world forever. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of military law in the freezing mud. The young captain from Hell's Kitchen stood alone in the snow, staring at the man who had just destroyed his world. Captain Sullivan stood in the freezing wind, his hand gripping the cold steel of his sidearm so tightly his knuckles turned white. He looked from the neat rows of executed medical staff directly into the face of the German major. The SS officer did not flinch. He adjusted his fur-lined collar and looked at the American captain with a look of pure, aristocratic detachment. "I am Major Hans von Kleist," the German officer said. Sullivan looked at the bodies in the tents, his voice shaking with a terrible rage. "You killed unarmed doctors," Sullivan said. "You shot wounded men in their beds." Kleist offered a brief, dismissive shrug. It was an issue of tactical necessity. Kleist said, "My unit was moving fast, and we had no extra rations or guards to waste on prisoners. It is standard wartime efficiency." "You violated the Geneva Convention," Sullivan said, stepping closer. "You slaughtered my brother." The German major looked down his nose at Sullivan's muddy uniform. "The convention is a scrap of paper for politicians," Kleist said. "In the field, reality dictates our choices. I acted under the authority of my high rank, and my actions are fully justified by the laws of survival." Sullivan pulled his pistol from its holster, the barrel trembling as he pointed it at the major's chest. "I should kill you right here in the snow," Sullivan said. Kleist did not break eye contact, his expression completely calm. "You will not shoot," Kleist said. "You are an American officer, and you are bound by your regulations. I am a gentleman of the officer class, and I demand my proper rights under military law." "I don't owe you a damn thing," Sullivan whispered. "You owe me professional military courtesy," Kleist answered sharply. "I require a private heated room immediately. Away from these common soldiers, I also expect a hot meal suited to my station, and a formal meeting with your superior command. We are both gentlemen of the officer corps, and we must maintain the proper hierarchies of combat, regardless of the unfortunate necessities of the battlefield." Sullivan stared at the man, his finger tightening on the trigger. He wanted to pull it, to end the man's arrogant speech right there. But the discipline of his training held him back by a fraction of an inch. He realized this monstrous level of entitlement was something he could not handle alone. He lowered the weapon, his chest heavy with grief and fury. "Keep him isolated under heavy guard," Sullivan told his sergeant. "Do not give him a drop of water." The sergeant nodded, pushing the German major back into the snow. Sullivan walked quickly to the command radio in his jeep, his voice tight as he called back to headquarters. He described the rows of dead medics, the executed patients, and the absolute lack of remorse from the SS commander. The report moved up the chain of command with terrifying speed, bypassing the regular colonels and staff officers. It reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top jeep roared through the snow, its tires throwing up gray slush against the frozen tents. The general stepped out before the vehicle had even come to a complete stop, his 4 stars catching the dim winter light, and his ivory-handled revolvers resting flat against his hips. The American soldiers instantly snapped to attention, their exhaustion forgotten as the general walked directly into the center of the camp. He did not raise his voice, but his cold presence made the entire field go dead silent. He walked straight toward the German major, his boots crunching heavily on the bloody snow. Patton studied him. "Did you command the force that took this crossroad last night?" Patton asked. "I did," Kleist answered, offering another sharp salute. "And did you order the clearance of this field hospital?" Patton asked. "I ordered the elimination of all occupants as a tactical necessity," Kleist said, his voice flat and unbothered. Patton stepped intimately close to the major, his eyes burning with a quiet, lethal intensity. "You want professional courtesy," Patton whispered. "I expect the standard privileges due to an officer of my standing," Kleist said, straightening his fur coat. "We are both military commanders." "You are no commander," Patton said. "You are a butcher who lacks the courage to face an armed enemy, so you turn your weapons on the helpless. You think your tailored coat and your family name elevate you above the dirt of this valley. But you have proven yourself lower than the beasts. You speak of military hierarchies, yet you have broken the most sacred trust of the warrior class. You chose to treat the wounded and their caretakers like garbage to be swept away for your convenience, and now you expect me to shield you from the consequences of your own rot. Two options remain for you today, Major. You will either accept the immediate justice of a common criminal, or you will perform the physical labor required to return this station to its proper state. You have 10 seconds to choose. You will either drop to your knees right now and begin undoing the filth you left behind, or my guards will terminate your command on this very spot. Decide now. The German major looked at Patton's unblinking stare, then down at the white snow, his supreme confidence evaporating in an instant as he realized the general was not negotiating. He slowly bent his knees and sank down into the freezing slush. The execution arrived with the cold, unyielding precision of a military tribunal. Under Patton's watchful glare, a squad of heavily armed American infantrymen stepped forward to enforce the sentence. They gripped the major by his shoulders, ignoring his sharp intakes of breath as the freezing snow soaked through his trousers. With rough, efficient movements, the soldiers ripped the silver SS runes from his collar, tore away his iron cross, and stripped him of his tailored fur coat, leaving him shivering in a thin uniform shirt. One private quickly fetched a piece of discarded shipping cardboard, scrawled the words "War Criminal" across it with a thick grease pencil, and slung it roughly over the German officer's neck with a frayed piece of twine. A standard-issue toothbrush was thrust into his freezing, trembling hand. For the next 48 hours, the proud aristocrat remained on his hands and knees in the bitter winter wind, tasked with scrubbing every square inch of dried blood from the wooden floorboards of the main medical tent. The American guards stood directly over him with loaded rifles, their orders absolute. If the major slowed down or stopped his frantic scrubbing for even a single minute, they were instructed to shoot him where he knelt. Fellow prisoners watched the public degradation in absolute, terrified silence. Captain Sullivan returned to New York City after the war, but the vibrant energy of Hell's Kitchen could no longer heal the emptiness in his chest. He left the military in late 1945, haunted by the memory of the field hospital and the brother he could not protect. He worked a quiet job as a nocturnal clerk for the Postal Service, avoiding crowded places and loud noises for the rest of his days. Sullivan never spoke about the winter of Bastogne to his family, but he kept his brother's recovered medical brass emblem in his pocket until he passed away quietly in 1978. Major Hans von Kleist did not escape the net of Allied justice after his temporary labor was completed. He was transferred to a high-security prison facility in Nuremberg to await formal prosecution for war crimes. During his trial in 1947, the former SS commander remained defiant, claiming his actions were fully justified by the breakdown of logistics during the winter retreat. The military tribunal rejected his defense, sentencing him to a life term of hard labor in a federal penitentiary. Kleist survived 10 years in confinement before being released early due to medical complications, returning to Munich, where he lived in bitter obscurity until his death in 1969. General Patton never included the specific details of the field hospital punishment in his official reports to Supreme Headquarters, keeping the incident tucked away in his personal diary. He viewed the mirrored punishment as a simple matter of maintaining basic human decency on a battlefield that had grown increasingly savage. In a private letter to his wife, written just weeks before his death in late 1945, he summarized his philosophy on the matter in one sharp line. "If we allow a man to hide butchery behind a pristine officer coat," Patton wrote, "then we have lost our right to win the war." Some historians have argued that Patton's field hospital verdict was a dangerous violation of the standard military legal code, claiming that summary punishments bypass the necessary protections of a formal court-martial. They suggest that such public humiliations risk eroding the professional discipline of the Army by replacing established regulations with the personal emotions of a theater commander. Others have argued the exact opposite, insisting that the sheer brutality of the SS actions required an immediate, visible response to preserve the moral authority of the Allied advance. They contend that traditional bureaucracy is entirely insufficient when dealing with absolute savagery in an active combat zone. What is certain is that the physical cleanup of the Crossroad Field Hospital stood as a permanent warning that high military rank would never be accepted as a shield against the consequences of butchery. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have pursued a standard court-martial instead? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.